The winter of 1878 arrived early in the hollows of Kentucky, and with it came a silence that pressed against the walls of the farmhouse like a held breath. Snow gathered along the fence posts, whitening the land that had been promised from father to son for generations, while inside, the hearth burned low and uneasy. She sat close to the fire, hands folded tight in her lap, listening to the house creak as if it, too, knew her secret. In this place, a woman's value was measured in heirs, and hers had been weighed and found wanting. Her husband no longer met her eyes. When he did, there was calculation where tenderness once lived, the kind that counts acres before heartbeats. Neighbors whispered with their smiles, and the preacher's sermons lingered on duty and obedience, words that curled like smoke and settled heavy in her lungs. At night, she prayed for mercy, but the prayers returned unanswered, echoing off the rafters. The brother came and went like a shadow, familiar and foreign all at once. He carried the same blood, the same name that the land demanded be continued. When the door closed and the latch slid home, the air thickened with a truth too monstrous to speak. Outside, the wind scoured the fields bare, and inside, something ancient and cruel stirred, an inheritance preserved not by love, but by force, fear, and the quiet agreement of a world that would never ask how the air was made. In the rural stretches of Kentucky in 1878, a woman's inability to conceive was not treated as a private sorrow but as a public failing, one that slowly escaped the walls of the home and settled into the minds of neighbors like an unspoken verdict. At first, the knowledge moved quietly, passed through glances held a second too long and conversations that stopped when she entered the room. The absence of a child was noticed not because it was announced, but because time itself exposed it. Seasons changed, harvests came and went, and still there was no cry in the night, no cradle near the hearth. In a community where lineage was survival, her empty womb became a topic as tangible as drought or debt. This awareness reshaped her position in the household and beyond it. Where she had once been greeted as a wife, she was now regarded as a question mark, an unresolved problem tied directly to the future of land and name. The family farm was more than property, it was proof of endurance, meant to pass cleanly from father to son. Without an heir, that chain appeared dangerously fragile, and she was placed at the center of that perceived weakness. Even ordinary tasks took on a sharper edge, as if every movement was being silently assessed for usefulness. The pressure did not arrive through open cruelty but through quiet correction. Older women offered remedies disguised as kindness, herbal cures and whispered advice that carried an undercurrent of blame. Men spoke around her, never to her, discussing legacy and bloodlines as though she were a missing tool rather than a living presence. The church reinforced the weight, sermons emphasizing fruitful unions and divine purpose, subtly suggesting that failure to produce was failure to fulfill God's design. Each word tightened the invisible circle around her. Inside her marriage, this public knowledge altered the balance entirely. Her husband's disappointment hardened into something colder, a sense that he had been cheated of his due. Affection faded, replaced by impatience and long silences that made the house feel cavernous. She felt herself shrinking under the collective gaze, her identity narrowing until it was defined by what she could not give. In that narrowing space, fear took root, because once a woman was seen as barren, solutions were no longer sought for her well-being, but for what could be taken from her to preserve the family line, even if it meant erasing her consent, her dignity, and her place as a wife in all but name. The unease surrounding the absence of an heir might have remained a simmering tension if not for the sudden reminder of how fragile the family line truly was. It arrived in the form of illness, quiet at first, then undeniable. An older relative, a man whose name carried weight in the county records and whose signature had secured the farm generations earlier, fell sick during the winter. His decline was spoken of in hushed tones, as though naming it aloud might hasten the inevitable. For her husband, this was not merely a personal fear but a warning bell, one that rang through every corner of his thoughts. As the sickbed grew closer to death, conversations in the household shifted. What had once been abstract worry hardened into urgency. The land deeds, the livestock, the future harvests all depended on continuity, and without a son to inherit, everything stood on uncertain ground. The husband began to calculate time not in years but in months, even weeks, measuring how long blood and name could survive without reinforcement. His anxiety manifested in restless pacing, clenched silences, and an obsession with order, as if control over small things might prevent the larger unraveling he feared. This sense of threat did not exist in isolation. The surrounding community, already aware of the missing heir, now sensed vulnerability. Distant cousins made polite visits that lingered too long, their eyes wandering over the land with thinly veiled interest. Neighbors spoke of disputed inheritances and farms lost to legal tangles, stories that struck him with the force of prophecy. In his mind, the illness transformed from misfortune into a test, one that demanded action rather than patience. Emotionally, the pressure distorted his perception of marriage and morality. Love became secondary to survival, vows bending beneath the weight of legacy. He began to view his wife not as a partner in grief but as a barrier to resolution, an obstacle standing between him and the certainty he craved. The fear of extinction, of being the last link in a once proud chain, justified thoughts he would have once rejected as unthinkable. Desperation sharpened his reasoning, narrowing it until only one goal remained clear: securing an heir before fate or sickness closed the door forever. In that narrowing, empathy faded, replaced by a cold resolve born from the belief that preserving the family line mattered more than preserving the humanity of those trapped within it. The turning point came cloaked in righteousness, delivered not through force but through carefully chosen words spoken from a place of supposed moral authority. The local preacher was a man trusted to interpret hardship as divine intent, and when the husband sought counsel, he did not ask directly for permission to do wrong. Instead, he spoke of fear, of legacy, of land slipping into the hands of strangers, framing his desperation as a burden placed upon him by circumstance rather than choice. The preacher listened, nodding slowly, his silence heavy with implication rather than refusal. What followed was not a command but a reframing, one that transformed cruelty into obligation. The preacher spoke of biblical lineages preserved through unconventional means, of women called to endure suffering for the greater good, of men tasked with difficult decisions to protect what God had entrusted to them. His words were deliberately vague, never naming the act itself, yet guiding the husband toward it all the same. By avoiding explicit endorsement, he absolved himself while granting the husband what he needed most: moral cover. This counsel carried weight far beyond the church walls. In a community where faith shaped law and conscience alike, the suggestion that desperation could be sanctified erased the last remaining hesitation. The husband returned home not with guilt but with a sense of grim purpose, convinced that his intent had been witnessed and silently approved by God's representative. The idea that once felt monstrous now wore the disguise of sacrifice, a burden he believed he was chosen to bear for the survival of his bloodline. For the wife, the preacher's influence was even more insidious. Though she was never directly consulted, sermons began to shift in tone, lingering on obedience, submission, and the virtue of women who endured unspeakable trials without complaint. Each word settled into her consciousness like a verdict already passed. Resistance, once a fragile hope, began to feel like rebellion not just against her husband but against divine order itself. Shame fused with fear, and faith, which had once offered comfort, now tightened its grip around her silence. By cloaking the decision in spiritual language, the act was stripped of its violence and recast as necessity. Responsibility dissolved upward, placed on scripture, tradition, and survival rather than human choice. In that moment, the path forward was no longer debated but accepted, because when authority blesses desperation, it transforms suffering into duty and removes the final barrier between thought and irreversible action. When the husband finally spoke, he did not frame his words as a demand but as a grim proposal, delivered in a tone meant to sound reasonable, even compassionate. He chose a night when the house was quiet and the fire burned low, as though secrecy itself would soften the blow. He spoke of legacy first, of the land and the name that had survived war, famine, and generations of hardship, carefully avoiding her eyes while he laid the foundation of his argument. By the time he named the solution, the weight of inevitability had already been placed upon her shoulders. He presented the arrangement as sacrifice rather than betrayal, insisting that personal feelings must yield to something larger and more enduring. The brother's involvement was described as practical, almost clinical, stripped of intimacy and emotion. He emphasized that it would not change her status as a wife, that it was merely a means to an end, a temporary measure to secure the future they were both said to share. In his telling, Her body became a vessel for continuity, her consent implied rather than requested. The cruelty of the proposal lay not only in its content but in its framing. He spoke as though no alternative existed, dismissing her shock with the language of duty and inevitability. Any hesitation on her part was met with quiet frustration, as if she were failing a test she had already been accused of losing. He reminded her of the whispers in the community, of how quickly a woman without children could be replaced or cast aside. Fear was woven into every sentence, not as threat but as warning. In that moment, the balance of power in the marriage was laid bare. His words carried the authority of landowner, husband, and man, reinforced by tradition and faith. Her silence was interpreted as agreement, her distress as weakness rather than refusal. He assured her that suffering, when endured for family, was noble, and that history would remember the result, not the cost. By the time he finished speaking, the decision had already been made in his mind, leaving her trapped between obedience and erasure, forced to confront the reality that her worth in this world had been reduced to what her body could produce, regardless of the violation required to make it so. The brother did not enter the arrangement with ambition or desire, but with a silence shaped by obligation and dread. From the moment he was summoned into the private conversation, he understood that refusal was never truly an option. Blood bound him tighter than law, and the weight of the family name pressed heavily against his chest as the proposal was explained in careful, restrained language. His older brother spoke as though outlining a business decision, emphasizing necessity, survival, and duty, leaving no room for moral debate. The brother listened, his face rigid, absorbing the expectation that loyalty required obedience even when it demanded the surrender of his own conscience. Shame took root immediately. He was not blind to the violation implied, nor to the fact that he was being asked to cross a line that could never be uncrossed. Yet every instinct to refuse collided with years of conditioning that placed family above self. The land they stood to lose was not abstract to him, it was soil he had worked, fences he had repaired, a legacy he had been taught to protect at all costs. To defy his brother was to risk being cast out, stripped of place and purpose in a world that offered little mercy to men who broke rank. The coercion was subtle but relentless. His brother framed compliance as sacrifice, reminding him of all that had been given and all that could be lost. He spoke of honor, of how true loyalty revealed itself in moments of discomfort, not ease. The implication was clear: refusal would mark him as weak, selfish, and disloyal, a stain that would follow him long after the land was gone. Even silence was interpreted as consent, the absence of protest taken as agreement under the weight of expectation. Emotionally, the brother became trapped between guilt and fear. He avoided the wife's eyes in the days that followed, knowing that acknowledgement would make his role undeniable. At night, he lay awake wrestling with the knowledge that obedience did not absolve him of responsibility, even if the decision had not been his to make. The arrangement demanded not only his body but his silence, his complicity sealed by the unspoken agreement that what was done would never be discussed aloud. By the time the moment arrived, resistance had been worn down not by conviction but by exhaustion. Loyalty had been weaponized against him, turning blood ties into chains. In submitting, he did not feel righteous or resolved, only diminished, aware that whatever legacy emerged from this act would carry with it a quiet corruption, one that no inheritance could ever truly erase. Her resistance did not vanish all at once, it eroded slowly, worn down by isolation, fear, and the careful manipulation of hope. At first, she told herself that silence was temporary, that she would find the strength to refuse once the shock settled. But the days stretched on, and with each passing hour, the walls seemed to close in tighter. There was no one to confide in without risking disgrace, no space where her thoughts could exist without judgment. Even the familiar rooms of the house felt hostile, filled with echoes of expectations she had not chosen but could not escape. Fear became a constant companion, not loud or dramatic, but steady and practical. She feared being sent away, feared becoming a whispered cautionary tale, feared losing even the fragile security she still possessed. In this world, a woman without a child and without a husband's protection stood perilously close to nothing. Her husband did not threaten her outright, he did not need to. His calm certainty, his assumption that compliance was inevitable, made resistance feel futile before it was even voiced. Each unspoken consequence loomed larger than any spoken demand. What finally weakened her resolve was the promise, however hollow, of restored honor. She was told that if a child came of this, her place would be secured, her worth affirmed in the only language the community truly respected. The future was painted as a narrow path out of disgrace, one that required her endurance now in exchange for peace later. She clung to the idea that suffering could be finite, that if she endured quietly, the ordeal would end with something resembling acceptance. Internally, she began to separate herself from what was being asked of her, retreating inward as a means of survival. She told herself that her body could endure what her heart could not, that obedience might protect some remaining part of her from complete erasure. The line between choice and coercion blurred until consent became a technicality rather than a truth. Each prayer she whispered shifted in tone, no longer asking for rescue but for numbness, for the strength not to break under the weight of what was coming. By the time she stopped resisting, it was not because she believed the act was right, but because resistance had become too costly. Survival, in its quietest and most devastating form, demanded surrender, and she stepped into that surrender knowing it would take something from her that could never be fully returned, even if the promise of honor was fulfilled. The night itself passed without witnesses, yet its consequences lingered as though the walls had absorbed every unspoken truth. Morning did not bring relief, only a brittle stillness that settled over the household. Each of them emerged altered, carrying a private fracture that showed in the smallest gestures. The wife moved through her tasks as if displaced from her own body, hands steady while her thoughts drifted elsewhere, unable to reconcile what had been done with the life she was expected to resume. Nothing looked different, and yet everything had shifted beyond recognition. Her husband watched closely, measuring outcomes rather than emotions. There was no tenderness in his gaze, only a restrained vigilance, as though he were waiting for proof that the sacrifice had been worthwhile. Any hint of remorse was buried beneath a growing impatience, a need for reassurance that his decision would deliver what he believed was owed to him. Silence became his refuge, allowing him to avoid confronting the cost while maintaining control over the narrative of necessity and duty. The brother fared no better. Guilt settled into him like a sickness, manifesting in restless nights and an aversion to shared spaces. He avoided the farmhouse when possible, inventing reasons to stay late in the fields or leave before dawn. When he could not avoid them, he kept his eyes down, his voice clipped, as though restraint might undo what had already been set in motion. His compliance had not brought peace, only a deeper awareness of his own complicity. Between the three of them, unspoken tension filled every room. Meals were eaten in near silence, chairs scraping against the floor sounding louder than words. Each glance carried suspicion, each pause a reminder of what could not be acknowledged. The wife felt herself becoming a repository for their shared shame, absorbing it because she had no means of release. Her isolation deepened, not only from the men involved but from herself, as though the person she had been before no longer had a place in this reality. Paranoia soon followed. Ordinary sounds took on ominous meaning, footsteps outside the house stirring fear of exposure. The wife found herself scrutinizing her own body, searching for signs that would either justify the suffering or condemn it as pointless. Hope and dread became inseparable, tangled so tightly that she could not tell which frightened her more. The aftermath of that single night fractured them in ways that no outcome could fully repair, planting seeds of fear and mistrust that would continue to grow in the quiet spaces between them. The shift did not announce itself loudly, but the community began to sense that something within the household had changed. In a place where routines were as predictable as the seasons, even the smallest deviation drew attention. The wife no longer lingered in conversation after church, offering only brief nods before retreating. Curtains were drawn earlier in the evening, doors closed more firmly than before. These details were subtle, but in a town accustomed to reading lives through habit, they stood out like misplaced stones on a well-worn path. Neighbors began to notice how often the brother was present and how quickly he looked away when addressed. Familiar warmth between the men had cooled into something strained, their exchanges clipped and careful. Whispers followed them down dirt roads and into market stalls, speculation blooming in the absence of facts. People spoke in half-questions and unfinished thoughts, careful not to accuse but eager to explain what they sensed. Silence, in such a place, was never neutral. it invited interpretation. The wife felt the weight of those glances wherever she went. She sensed eyes tracking her movements, measuring her posture, her expression, her body for signs of change. Each visit to the general store felt like a test she had not studied for, every polite greeting layered with curiosity. She became hyper-aware of herself, guarding every word and gesture, knowing that one misplaced look could unravel what little stability remained. The town did not need proof to begin forming conclusions, suspicion was enough. Inside the home, this growing awareness fed the tension already coiled tight. The husband grew more vigilant, insisting on appearances being maintained, reminding her of what was at stake if rumors hardened into belief. The brothers' visits became more calculated, timed to avoid notice, yet their very caution made them seem more conspicuous. Fear of discovery turned ordinary life into performance, each of them playing a role under the imagined gaze of the entire community. What made the rumors most dangerous was not their accuracy but their momentum. Once people began to sense fracture, they searched for meaning, and meaning in such places often carried judgment. The wife understood that should the truth surface, blame would not be evenly shared. She would bear the brunt of it, her body and reputation offered up as explanation and warning alike. As whispers multiplied and glances sharpened, the fragile balance holding their secret began to tremble, and the safety they believed silence provided started to feel as uncertain as exposure itself. The news of her pregnancy arrived not with joy, but with a tension so sharp it cut through the household like a winter wind. There was no celebration, no laughter to mark the moment. Instead, the revelation hovered between them, a fragile, dangerous thing that promised both hope and terror. For her husband, the knowledge brought relief wrapped in obsession, a sense that his legacy might finally be secured, yet shadowed by the fear that even this outcome could unravel under scrutiny. He measured every movement, every glance, as though proof of the child's existence needed constant verification, a living talisman to justify the choice that had been made. The wife felt no triumph. Her body had finally carried life, but the achievement did not erase the memory of how it had come to be. Every flutter within her was a reminder of betrayal, a living testament to coercion and loss. Joy was complicated by guilt, shame, and the knowledge that the child, innocent though it would be, was conceived under the weight of manipulation and desperation. She could not separate the new life from the fractured loyalty and stolen autonomy that preceded it. The brother's awareness of the pregnancy brought a new, unbearable tension. His presence became even more fraught. He moved with caution, speaking less, avoiding the eyes of both his brother and the woman he had been forced to involve himself with. The child growing inside her was a reminder of his complicity, a living evidence of a night that could never be undone. Each day, he felt the pressure of silent responsibility pressing heavier upon him, a guilt that could not be shared, only borne. In the household, the pregnancy began to redraw the lines of power and fear. The husband assumed vigilance as duty, monitoring her with a mixture of protectiveness and control, while the wife's inner life tightened further around secrecy and dread. The child represented both hope and risk, hope that the family name would endure, risk that the truth might surface, that the circumstances of conception could unravel everything. The knowledge transformed ordinary acts, feeding, walking, working in the fields, into careful calculations, each one weighed against what it might reveal to the world outside. Beyond the walls of the home, whispers and glances grew sharper, now laced with suspicion that something significant was underway. People noticed the subtle changes in her body and demeanor, piecing together fragments of evidence without ever knowing the full truth. The pregnancy, instead of offering safety or legitimacy, became another point of tension, a constant reminder that the fragile balance between secrecy and exposure could collapse at any moment, carrying with it consequences none of them were prepared to confront. The fragile concealment that had sustained them since the first unspoken decision began to fray as the inevitability of discovery crept closer with every passing day. Rumors, once small and uncertain, had begun to take shape, carried in half-spoken sentences and careful glances at church gatherings, in market stalls, and along dusty roads. The neighbors' quiet observations, harmless at first, had grown sharper, and the weight of speculation pressed against the walls of the house like a storm on the horizon. Even a casual question from a visitor or the sudden arrival of an unfamiliar face could send tension coiling tighter, each glance and word now heavy with suspicion and latent accusation. Within the household, the constant vigilance demanded by secrecy began to strain relationships to the breaking point. The husband's control intensified as he sought to manage both the perception of others and the delicate balance between his wife and his brother. Every decision, every interaction, was measured against the possibility of exposure. He became impatient, less able to conceal the anxiety simmering beneath his composed exterior, and his actions, once confident and resolute, now carried the edge of fear. The wife, for her part, felt increasingly trapped, burdened by the dual pressure of protecting herself and guarding the secret that was not hers alone. Each movement, each word she uttered, was scrutinized in her mind as if she were already being judged by the unseen eyes of the town. The brother, too, experienced a deepening tension that gnawed at him silently. His complicity, once abstract in theory, became concrete every time someone inquired after the household or remarked upon the couple's apparent change. The pregnancy, the rumors, and the unspoken knowledge of the night that had set these events in motion created a suffocating moral weight he could neither share nor escape. Guilt became an invisible companion, sitting between them in every room, turning ordinary conversations into careful performances. The larger consequences loomed beyond personal shame or family discord. The truth, if revealed, threatened the stability of inheritance, the respectability of the household, and the social standing that had been meticulously cultivated over generations. It would not only expose the intimate violation that had occurred but also cast judgment upon each actor in the drama, blurring the lines between victim and participant. The possibility of discovery forced them to confront a cruel reality, that survival, honor, and continuity had been built on a foundation of fear and coercion, and that the fragile equilibrium they had maintained could collapse at any moment, leaving ruin in its wake. Every whispered comment, every scrutinizing glance, every minor incident carried the potential to unmask the truth, and the shadow of exposure hung over them relentlessly, ensuring that even the smallest misstep could ignite a reckoning that none of them were prepared to face.